Hello, welcome to you and the law. This is the show that brings the law closer to the people, making it understandable, accessible, and relevant. I am Mahmoud Mbouch. Today we're going to turn our attention to Chapter 4 of the Gambia's Constitution, the Bill of Rights. This is the chapter that's often called the heart of the Constitution because it spells out our fundamental rights and freedoms, and also from the right to life, liberty, freedom of expression, movement, protection from discrimination, the whole lot. So to help me here unpack what these rights actually mean in practice, I've got the famous, well-known around the country, lawyer, Mr. Abdullah Fati, not a stranger to QTV. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
That's it. So let's go to the heart of this. The Bill of Rights. What are we referring to in constitutional terms?
We're referring to basic human rights. So it emanates from this concept that as humans, by virtue of being human, certain rights are inherent by virtue of you being human. And these rights are universal and inalienable. That means you cannot be easily deprived of these rights. And the United Nations General Assembly, I think it was in 1948, adopted the Universal Declaration of these rights. And you know, this would have been as a result of the First World War, the Second World War. But generally the world came together to codify, to agree internationally that amongst nation states there has to be a certain minimum standards in recognition of certain basic human rights. So the Chapter 4 rights, which is the rights concerned with the protection and the enforcement of fundamental rights and freedoms, are sort of all derived from this UN instrument, the Universal Declaration, in essence.
But are these rights universal? Because you would read some writers saying that they are not universal, they're culture specific, even ideology specific, maybe the liberal idea from John Locke talking about natural rights. How do you respond to this?
Okay, largely these rights are generic and largely universal. Obviously,
who determines that?
Because of the customary nature and how these things operate at the international level. Because if you look at, for example, the Constitution of Pakistan, and look at the Constitution of Zimbabwe, or look at the Constitution of Singapore or Malaysia, Gambia, or even France or Germany, America. So some of these basic rights, like the right to life, the right to privacy, the right to free speech, the right to fair trial. So all of these things are rights that are embedded in almost all domestic constitutions anywhere in the world. So they are culture specific, and even at the more advanced human rights level, there's what we call cultural relativism. But that's sort of like when it comes to certain rights, because even at the time, 1948, some countries like South Africa, some countries like Saudi Arabia, and the others abstained from the recognition because of because there was apartheid in South Africa, and Saudi Arabia maybe because of rights in relation to sexual orientation and stuff like that. So that means in certain circumstances, even at the European Union level, what we can call margin of appreciation, where states are given a certain allowance to maybe sort of deviate from what's by and large, a large chunk of these basic rights are inherently universal.
Yes, but this is really the key here. There's something that you're trying to do here. You've mentioned cultural relativism, and yet you've also mentioned the universalism of things. Which one is it? The cultural relativist, well, you're really denying people their rights.
In a way, yes. In a way, but I think because we have to understand the complexity of relationship building at the international level, building alliances and stuff like that. So in order to probably get a certain level of acceptance, even maybe at the ECOWAS level, there may be certain stuff. So maybe, for example, a certain country may say, well, in order for you to be married, because of our cultural setup, you have to be 21. Whereas maybe the common customary practice in the area that when you're 18 you can get married. But maybe a country like Mauritania, for example, which is a part of the ECOWAS, I'm giving an example, can say, for example, well, because of some of our cultural norms and values, you can get married at 16. Something of that sort. But these are exceptions. These are exceptional deviations from the norm. But by and large, there is a large degree of universalism to basic rights.
Okay. Are these rights absolute, or there are limits?
Some rights are absolute.
For instance?
Some rights are not. For example, the right against torture. The right not to be tortured is absolute. The right to life is not absolute. So, for example, you have a right to life, but under exceptional circumstances, the state may intervene and deprive. So, for example, somebody has committed murder, have gone through trial and sentenced to death penalty. Under those circumstances, the law is saying, well, your right to life can be interfered with under these circumstances. But the right against torture, for example, the right not to be tortured, under no circumstance whatsoever, can a state derogate itself from this obligation. So, for example, the example generally is, for example, you have people at the Independence Stadium, packed full of football supporters, and a person is arrested, and they have a device planted there, and they only have an hour to retrieve this device, otherwise it will explode and everybody would die. But the law said even under those circumstances, that person cannot be tortured in order to retrieve that information. So the law is saying that, well, legally, so far as human rights is concerned, those people can die, everybody at the stadium, but you cannot say because you want to protect those lives, this person must be tortured. So torture is one. There are others as well, where they are absolutely sort of like cemented and cannot be interfered with under no circumstance.
That's it. But the death penalty,
right to life, for example, yes,
exactly,
which means it can only be certain, and there are other things. So, for example, even right, for example, your right to privacy and confidentiality. So, for example, even these rights, but our normal rights as well. So that's what say where your right and somebody else's. So most of these rights are not absolute because they are also subject, for example, national security. They are also subject to the reasonable test so that they don't also interfere unreasonably to other people's rights as well.
Okay, we'll get to the right to privacy afterwards. But first, the right to personal liberty. What protections do citizens have, really, against arbitrary arrest or detention?
Very good question. I think the safeguards would be in the new criminal legislation, the Criminal Offences Act of 2025 and the Criminal Procedure Act of 2025. But there are other, but the Constitution as well. So, for example, you cannot see somebody walking down the street and simply jump on them and arrest. So the law is saying that there must be a reasonable belief that that person is committing an offense, or there is a reasonable that they've committed an offense, or they are in an act or have something of that sort. So there must be a certain degree of belief, and that belief must be reasonable in order for it to be acted upon. That is one part, but where that has even been effected, so for example, where a person has been arrested, it doesn't end there. We had a conversation last week. Yes. That person has rights, even when they are under state custody. You have to inform them as soon as possible, within 3 hours, the offense that they have committed, inform family members, their right to legal representation, to a lawyer of their choice. For certain offenses where they don't have access, then the state itself will provide a lawyer at the expense of the state. And in any way, in any event, that they cannot be kept longer than 72 hours without either taking them to court or granting them bail. But these are all safeguards to make sure that the basic right, the fundamental rights and freedoms, that depriving somebody of their personal liberty should always be a last resort and should always be anchored on substance, stopping merely being where you've broken the law.
What remedies exist if my rights are violated?
Okay, in terms of legally speaking, Chapter 4 rights, fundamental rights and freedoms, non-discrimination, for example, or rights to exercise political rights. Okay, so you cannot turn around and just say, well, if you are Manjago, then you are not eligible to contest as president because it's a minority. So that will be discriminating against you because of your ethnicity or something of that sort. So far as the Constitution is concerned, breach of fundamental rights and freedoms in Chapter 4, in terms of enforcement and application, that power is vested in the High Court. So you can go to the High Court for enforcement of rights and freedoms. But in terms of interpretation, then the jurisdiction will fall under the Supreme Court. But that is a more sort of cumbersome legal remedy. In terms of more practical remedy, we have the National Human Rights Commission. So, for example, where a person's civil liberty or person's basic rights under Chapter 4, basic human rights are violated, then a person can go to the National Human Rights Commission. The National Human Rights Commission, as part of its mandate, statutory mandate, has the power to investigate human rights violations and to remedy. So they can sort of admonish state institutions who may have done some of these things. They can make recommendations, and they might, under some circumstances, may even take some punitive measures. I
was going to come to that. They really cannot enforce their decisions. Recommendations and other authorities would have to take them up or not.
Yeah, because obviously, you know, if, for example, the finding is against the Gambia National Army or the Gambia Police Force, if they refuse, they have certain powers because they can go maybe all the way to the National Assembly. But unlike the courts where a judge has a power to, upon an application, a judge can find, for example, the police or the army or anybody in contempt of court. Some of those powers are not so the national human right, but because it's more like a civil political sort of administrative mechanism rather than a judicial mechanism. So in terms of enforcement, but you find this even at the UN level, even at the ICJ.
Granted, it's my right to assemble with people, you know, the right to assembly, yet I need a permit from the police. What do you see about that?
So this is highly problematic and highly contentious. So the argument is, in a liberal democracy, 65 years after independence, and where these rights are contained expressly in the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, and where people also have a right to assemble, they have a right to express their dissatisfaction so far as it normally contains the state or state decisions. The fact that you have to go to the Inspector General of Police and seek a permit, to so many libertarians, this is seen as, for example, inconsistent with the ideals of a true democracy, and maybe it is in a way inconsistent with the rule of law in a way, although that can be a bit shaky. But my own personal view on this matter is, okay, to actually seek permit from the police, I disagree with. Because, yes, I agree the police may be involved, but like it happens in the West.
It's important that the police are involved.
Okay,
you know, because they have to protect other rights.
My argument here is, the involvement of the police is to make sure that they preserve law and order. So, for example, if the youth, gala, or young people, or whoever, want to go out and protest against anything, any legitimate thing, that is a right. For example, if the protests were to be commenced from the traffic light to Westfield this Sunday, for example, or in a month's time, that the involvement of the police is not per se to seek the authority and the express permission of the IGP to exercise that constitutional right, but the involvement of the IGP would be primarily to facilitate. And what I mean facilitate is to ensure that this actually happens, and that it should happen, and that it should only be on those oddities where it cannot happen. For example, you want to do that on the 18th of February, for example, and they tell you, well, you cannot do it because we're going to deploy a lot of our people at the Independence Stadium or McCarthy Square, and therefore we may have enough numbers to police that gathering. But generally, involvement of police is to just ensure the safety and the security of the people involved, and also others who are not part of it. Something of that sort, and it should be very minimal. And to be only there to preserve law and order, but not to vest that authority in the IGP to determine who and when to give permit. And I believe you can achieve it both ends. You can have a case where the IGP be involved, but just like during elections where political parties write to the IGP to say, we want to caravan here, and normally they will facilitate because we are in a political season. The same thing can be replicated during normal times.
So in other words, you're giving the police notice, not seeking permission.
Yeah,
essentially.
Notice to help. And the idea again will be for the police to actually help and facilitate, just like you see in the West, but not where you are vesting this exclusive authority in the police to make that. I think those powers ought to be vested with the courts.
But this is the key, isn't it? Now we appear to have entrenched this idea of getting permission. How do we move away from this? What are the bottlenecks? What's going on?
We need to have a serious conversation. That some of these bottlenecks, some of these constraints are not consistent in the 21st century in a democracy. Okay, they're not. These are stuff that you would have expected, maybe even in the UK on countries like that. You know, back then maybe you did, but now in terms, so to be deprived of the right to protest should only be based on independent police operational assessment.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned there's something very important. The world we're in right now. This takes us to the right of to privacy in a world of digital surveillance, social media. How can we protect this right?
Well, there's the Data Protection Act that was passed recently, but in a way that is also part of international, so that when you come into contact with data, that you preserve and safeguard, and not to sort of like to respect, in simple terms, to respect data. But here, in terms of respect for privacy, what we are saying here is, I can't be walking down the street, I'm stopped by a police officer for no reason, be like, oh, because I am a political person, be like, oh, we need to go into your phone to check your emails and messages, or more covertly, where the state be like, okay, what may some high-profile political figure, what is he saying? We want to know who is he talking to. So what we're now going to do is we will now go and tap his phone or interfere with his email or something of that, so that we know what he's doing. So what we say that individual has a right to privacy and confidentiality, to that information not to be interfered with by the state, unless, for example, you are engaged in a criminal enterprise in which, for example, but even that, I suppose, those limits where you are. But ordinarily, the law is saying that I am entitled to this right. But again, these rights are not absolute.
The right to property. What does the Constitution say about compulsory acquisitions by the state?
It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen.
Even in emergencies?
But no, what I mean is, but there are caveats.
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
So for example, what we mean here is that the state cannot just go to Batokunku or Tujareng or anywhere, Nyomi, Jirunku or somewhere, go there tomorrow and say, well, hectares of this land, people's farmland or whatever, that the state is seizing this because it wants to build hospitals. Okay, the state has the power. Under the States Lands Act, the state can acquire, can take land for public use. there is also a corresponding legislation, the Land Acquisition and Compensation Act. So that means the state has the power, but there must be a relative corresponding compensation. But the essence here is that the compulsory thing here is, like, for example, we look at places like Salaji and others, that if the state, for example, wants to go to Gunjur, take a certain land, because we're thinking, well, we need to build a university. We need land. So the state can take that land, obviously we're taking it from the indigenous local population, but you're going to be building a university or a public facility for public use. So the state gives you that but it doesn't mean you just go and do it. So there must be consultation with the people who are affected must be compensated.
And compensation.
Something of that
Absolutely.
sort. So that means, so it's saying that is, for example, you don't put it, not only land, but property as well. So the state cannot come to my compound and evict me. That is why not even the president has that power. That's why even with eviction stuff like it, it has to be courts that has to make a decision. Even the execution of those things are done by the sheriff.
Well put. Freedom of expression, especially in this age of hate speech. What does it cover, this freedom of expression? What does it cover? What are the limits?
Well, basically, all of us in a liberal democracy should have the right to express ourselves, to speak, so long as what you say doesn't infringe. But this is a very fine line. You say, some people say some utterly ridiculous stuff, but it is still seen as within the rubric of free speech and stuff like that. But however, if I stand here and say a certain ethnic group are bad, we need to go after them, they're evil, my justification of saying that I have a right to free speech cannot override those people's rights.
So contending with other rights.
Yes, so clearly here, you see whether am I actually inciting violence against those people, or am I causing discord? So something along those lines. But if I sit here and criticize the state all day long in relation to tariffs or in relation to how certain state decisions are made, the contemplation is that somebody ought not to be politically prosecuted or persecuted for expressing those opinions and those views, because that is what enriches any liberal democracy.
Absolutely. You're coming towards the end. Now, rights and responsibilities. Back to us, our citizens. How do we exercise our rights responsibly?
Okay. So, Chapter 4 rights, the Constitution is saying that, for example, the duty bearer, the primary duty bearer is the state, the executive, so the army, the police, the whole architecture of the state. But we as citizens as well, we have a responsibility. So, for example, our responsibility as citizens is to make sure that we are, well, in simple terms, are good citizens, good neighbors. So, for example, we pay taxes, we respect other people, so we respect diversity in our population. So, for example, Gambia is a predominantly Muslim country, but that our imams or that Muslims respect that there are Christians in this country, or there are people who believe in some other forms. That regardless of Gambia being 90 or something Muslim, that we ought to also respect the religious rights of the others. So for example, there is that duty on the state. Essentially, I think the state is to facilitate by laws and everything, the environment. But citizens are very, although are secondary, but are very, very important in this, because it is the citizens, like that, it is us who have the sovereignty on which the state exercises its powers. But it is us to assist the state in making sure that we safeguard rights and freedoms.
Yes, I do hear that ignorance of the law is no excuse. ignorance of the Constitution? Does that give me right to violate other people's rights? What about a good number of the law enforcement officers really do not know what the laws are?
Okay, so a lot of these things, that's why we say they are universal. Or at a certain point they have become customary. Okay, we know, okay, there is no law that says that you greet people with your left hand. That is not governed by law. It's not prescribed in statute, but as humans, as civilized people, we say, well, when you meet somebody, the polite thing is to shake their hand with your right hand. That is the. So when you do it with your left, it is seen as odd, as it deviates from the normal practice. So in terms, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So in terms of sorry.
It's all right.
Yeah.
We've come to the end, really. So how can we, ordinary citizens, how can we help uphold the values of Chapter 4?
Okay, so this is now based on, okay, now yes. I remember,
exactly.
Ignorance of the law.
Ignorance of the
so
law.
For example, now, especially when we're talking about the state. So coming back to that, like when I gave the hand example, because we are saying that civilized people behave civilizedly. So for example, there doesn't need to be a legislation to say that when somebody is arrested and they brought to the police station, that before you even speak to them, you give them a slap. I'm not saying that happens, but I'm just saying, for example, there doesn't need to be a book you open to say, well, section 15, section that. You're not supposed to do that, okay? Because we are civilized people. You can have a conversation without resorting to slapping somebody. So now it comes to citizens and the state itself. So in terms of whether ignorance of the law or how we can. So for us as citizens, I think, personally, I sometimes I'm very disappointed. When I look at Senegal, I think people are very demanding of their rights. It looks like they're very conscious of their rights. And if you're conscious of it, then you will demand greater and more enhanced level of accountability.
Isn't it similar here? We saw Ghana recently and they've been protesting.
A very small number.
Okay.
But it's almost like it's a small number. The majority of us seem to be so indifferent. So we may not be particularly happy about something, but it's like but it is a form of good citizenship. But we also behaved the right way. So you don't be speeding 150 miles per hour in the public. So all of those things are, for example, in places like Japan or places like Singapore, you see certain things and nobody is told, but there is a certain orderliness in society, and that is good citizenship.
Absolutely. Over here, the last time when you appeared on This Morning, you gave us that anecdote of how the Deputy Inspector General of Police treated you, was so curt as it were, in his behavior. Yeah. That tells you how far
So
we
under those circumstances,
that's it.
Away from even my professional, but as good citizens, is that the way you treat a fellow professional?
Absolutely. The Constitution is only as strong as the people.
Absolutely.
It depends on what we do.
No matter how strong a law is,
it depends on the people.
It depends on the people.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of this program. Thank you very much, Abdullah Fatih, for your time and the insights there. And to our viewers, until the next time, I'm Ubudumbuch. Goodbye.